Dead Island 2 had been in development hell for nearly 10 years. Announced all the way back in 2014, Dead Island 2 was the sequel to both 2011's Dead Island and 2013's Dead Island Riptide, and had experienced a very rough development cycle. After all, the project exchanged studios multiple times until landing with developer Dambuster Studios, who began working on the game in earnest in 2019. And now in 2023, the year of our Lord, Dead Island 2 has broken free from development hell like an introvert canceling plans in order to break free from any form of social engagement. I know this because that introvert be me. And miraculously, Dead Island 2 has now released into the wild, because despite being trapped in development hell for so long, Dead Island 2 is a game that can actually be played now. It's a real thing that people can experience. And surprisingly, Dead Island 2 is actually fairly solid. It's pretty decent, which was not always a guarantee. After all, many games in development hell that do end up releasing just don't turn out all that well and feel like incohesive messes shoved out the door in order for developers and publishers to just get rid of that aforementioned game and get the inevitable critical beating over with. Looking at you, Duke Nukem Forever, you know what you did. But going against the grain, Dead Island 2 is actually fun. While sure, the game has a multitude of issues like bad writing, a non-impactful story, and some questionable design choices, Dead Island 2's core gameplay zombie slaying loop is overall enjoyable, mostly because when it comes to slicing and dicing the undead, the game is a fairly good time. It's fun. Dead Island 2's positive gameplay qualities start with its class-based nature. In fact, whether played solo or cooperatively, the player starts the game by picking a character from a selection of optional playable protagonists that have their own inherent strengths and weaknesses. And for me, I picked Carla, because she is a powerhouse that places an emphasis on blocking zombie attacks, as well as then performing counterattacks. And after an introductory sequence that shows your character being bitten by a zombie, something that your player character survives due to being immune, your player-controlled protagonist can traverse an apocalyptic LA. That level design-wise isn't technically an open world due to how various parts of the city are divvied up into smaller, yet still sizable sections, smaller maps of the world that are just overrun with zombies for you to fight. And that is where the fun truly begins, because on its base level, Dead Island 2's combat is enjoyable. Scattered throughout LA, you can find a wide variety of wieldable objects that can be used as weapons like baseball bats, sledgehammers, swords, and etc. that you can use to pummel the hapless undead, much like how a college roommate pummels their incredibly fragile dorm room mattress with their and from there, all of these weapons have their own strengths and deficiencies in terms of how much damage they dole out, how fast the weapon can land blows, how much force can be applied, and whether or not a weapon can sever undead limbs. There's just a lot going on with the combat. And that's even before discussing how the robust weapon wheel allows you to quickly change between a multitude of weapons with ease, and the fact that, in terms of visual design and audio feedback, decapitating zombies makes the player feel like a badass, all while curb stomping the undead just has a very satisfying crunch to it. It's like the sound of chomping on cereal. There's something just aesthetically pleasing to it. It just feels good to slay the dead. And as a baseline, fighting zombies in this game is enjoyable. It's a good time. But it's Dead Island 2's pacing that really keeps the whole gameplay loop feeling invigorating. In fact, the game regularly introduces new enemy types and weapons that the player can use, and then there's a crafting system that lets the player modify their weapons and imbue those aforementioned weapons with statuses like Ignite, Bleed, Melt, and Electrify, and apply other stat boosts, my favorite being Impact due to how it made me feel like a troll storming the gate of Minas Tirith, except with zombies, because I sent a lot of those fuckers flying. Furthermore, Dead Island 2 has a great progression system that really helps the game's sense of pace. In true role-playing game fashion, the player regularly levels up and unlocks new abilities or modifications for their existing abilities that can further strengthen every given player's playstyle. Like, for example, once I unlocked the ability to ground pound and send zombies flying Team Rocket style, I knew there was no going back. And that, as well as the other abilities that you can accrue throughout the game, was really satisfying, mostly because the new skills that the player can accrue throughout the game could really change their playstyle as they mix and match swappable abilities and passive boosts that can really complement the way that you play the game. And while I initially disliked how you could only have a few of those upgrades and abilities equipped at a single time, while the rest of those abilities lay unused, which, is a design decision that befits a class-based cooperative multiplayer game, i.e. the type of game that Dead Island 2 is, rather than a single-player adventure that sad, lonely fucks like myself honestly prefer, leveling up and gaining new abilities and and stat boosts ensure that the player character always feels more powerful than before. Even though you can't equip everything you unlock at the same time, leveling up still remains a thrill. And when combined with the enemy variety, the weapon modification system, and the fact that you don't have to wait too long to be able to use guns, which is awesome, your character becomes death incarnate for the undead, or the undeath incarnate if you will. And in that regard, Dead Island 2's combat is very satisfying. However, with that being said, Dead Island 2 does have some faults in its design. In fact, its levels, despite how satisfying it is to loot and forage for items that the player can use to craft weapon modifications, don't really encourage all that much exploration. Like, sure, there are side quests that will inspire the player to retread familiar ground, and you can find some interesting weapons within the various nooks and crannies of Dead Island 2's world, but overall, there's little reason to be curious about exploring the game's various environments, because seeing as you can learn about various side quests on the radio near safe areas, and how you can already discover or earn useful weapons and modifications by just playing the main quest or being rewarded them for completing side quests and such, there isn't really much of a good excuse to heavily scour the game's environments. There's little reason to go off the beaten path in Dead Island 2, which is unfortunate for a game of this type. With that being said though, that is a forgivable problem given that the rest of Dead Island 2's design is so much fun, because you know, the combats and the progression system is enjoyable in and of itself. But unfortunately, the game does have less forgivable flaws when it comes to its writing, both in terms of Dead Island 2's overall narrative and its characters. See, the game's writing strives for two things. Firstly, it tries to have a narrative that's meant to be taken with some level of sincerity. Well, not like a prestige movie or video game, because to be clear, Dead Island 2 is not the fucking Last of Us, but more in the sense that you're on a baseline supposed to care about the characters and its conflict resolution. And secondly, it tries to have the plot and the fun of a B movie, i.e. the type of movie that is tonally silly and not really known for its important character development or a very nuanced narrative. And sadly, when striving for both of these tonal opposites, Dead Island accomplishes neither. In fact, the supporting characters and their comedic banter fall flat, mostly because they're caricatures of Hollywood elites and LA residents, i.e. these characters are fame-focused, self-centered, and etc. And while sure, it is more than okay to criticize Hollywood, hell, the show Barry absolutely scorches the entertainment industry with cutting satire, and it's one of my favorite TV shows of all time. But Dead Island 2's commentary on Hollywood lacks dimension and is very surface level, i.e. it shows how the people of Beverly Hills have lots of vanity and are fame-focused, because this game really does indulge in the concept of a cliche, which makes most of the supporting characters be extremely unlikable and unfunny. And honestly, it's as if Dead Island 2's character writing was striving to be on the level of Borderlands 2, which was a silly good time that still had some level of narrative stakes, but instead became Borderlands 3, you know, a game that had writing that was trying to be a humorous and enjoyable experience, yet was anything but, just like Dead Island 2's writing and character development. And to make matters worse, my main character Carla isn't much better. She lacks meaningful depth and rarely takes the events of the game with any form of sincerity. And that's a problem since the game does have a few baseline narrative stakes that attempt to make the player at least somewhat care about the story and the characters, yet the player just cannot do that due to the huge tonal whiplash on display here. Like, the characters are baseline parodies of Hollywood stereotypes that are just incredibly played out and unfunny, and so much of the game just feels carefree, even its protagonist, or protagonists rather. Yet despite this, Dead Island 2 still has moments where it tries to make you care about the narrative, and it just doesn't work. The writing really falls flat here. Still, Dead Island 2 is overall a solid experience worth checking out. While the writing is suspect and there are some issues with the game's design, the core gameplay and progression system is fairly strong. It's just a lot of fun to kill hordes of zombies in creative ways in this game, and despite its faults, I had fun with Dead Island 2, which is honestly more than what I can say for many games these days, which often prioritize live service nonsense and microtransactions, i.e. things that suck the joy out of gaming, i.e. things that suck. And thankfully, Dead Island 2 has none of that bullshit and is all the better for it, because Dead Island 2 is overall a solid game, and truly I am grateful that it was able to escape development hell. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of Dead Island 2. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you into this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make review and impressions requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.